please. Thank you.
Dear colleagues, it is my pleasure to be speaking with you today. Although I cannot be with you in person, I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak with you at this pivotal moment in history where we, as a global community, are striving hard to accelerate action at scale for people everywhere and for our planet. Energy touches every aspect of our lives, but it accounts for 2/3 of greenhouse gas emissions. With business as usual, we will be at dangerously close to hitting 1.5 degrees Celsius in the near term. At the same time, another related crisis looms large. Close to 759 million people lack access to electricity, and 2.6 billion people live without clean cooking solutions. And in a warming world, over 1 billion people face immediate risk because they lack the access to sustainable cooling. We must provide access to modern and sustainable energy services for economic development, growth, and prosperity. For us to drastically reduce emissions and ensure a just and equitable energy transition, investment in clean energy at a much greater scale than we've seen to date must be a priority for governments, private sector, and all decision makers. Asia has been leading the charge in the clean energy transition for developing countries. It is now cheaper to build new renewable energy than coal, and most importantly, in many places it is cheaper to build new renewable capacity with storage than continue to operate existing coal plants. This shift to renewables will take us closer to a net zero future. Decarbonization of the Asian economic machine will be key to achieving global net zero targets. Energy efficiency and electrification of industries and electrification of mobility with renewables is a major challenge, but also presents major opportunities. The region has seen some of the most significant development in e-vehicles uptake in recent years, but much more needs to be done. For the energy industry, there are many opportunities that will emerge. Specifically, the energy industry will need to evolve and develop a robust renewable energy business ecosystem in developing and emerging markets at the local level. This includes incentivizing local supply chains, improving local labor markets, and facilitating opportunities for local financiers to build renewable energy industries. One of the big challenges, however, in achieving these goals is the tremendous inadequate amount of investment for energy access, the energy transition, and climate action for developing countries. We need to see much greater ambition and commitment, but more importantly, followed by action. I urge global leaders to act on accelerating the clean energy revolution through technical as well as financial support in order to enable a just and equitable clean energy transition for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ogunbiyi, and that's a perfect introduction to our panel that's getting ready to really continue this conversation about how we can break through these hurdles. And it's incredible to be able to see and to hear off the bat that Asia is really leading the charge in terms of creating renewables for developing nations. And we'll speak a little bit more about Vietnam and how spectacular their growth has been for solar. One thing I want to make sure is that we are all involved in the coming conversation. I said earlier that the value we extract from this is completely up to you. So for those of you who are joining us online on ecosperity.live, you'll be able to see there's a bar on the side. Q&A is there, polling is there. Please go ahead and submit those burning questions that you have for our panel. You can also vote for the questions that are relevant for you if you've seen that someone else has beat you to it. Those of you joining us on LinkedIn, have a look at the comments section, the streaming comments section. We should have a link there for you to come on board for Q&A and certainly for a poll, which we're about to do. Those of you here at Marina Bay Sands, if you'd like to get involved, and we highly encourage you to do so, please go ahead and scan the QR codes in front of you on the table. We're going to try out this first poll to make sure that those of you online and on site can be a part of this conversation, and this is going to lead into the panel. So if you could all please submit your answers answers. What do you think? The question is, in 2021, global investment in the low-carbon energy transition totaled what? You have a few choices here. Those of you online, those of you here on site, please go ahead, and we'll reveal it in just a second. So far, good news in terms of what's happening in our region, in our neck of the woods. Still a lot to be done, but Vietnam saw spectacular growth. I mean, they rose 300% in terms of solar energy use. They did that in just 1 year. So it's really exciting to see what's happening there. So let's see what you all think. A little bit of food for thought as I invite Caroline, our moderator, to tell you why we are asking this question. Is there enough? And what can we do about it? Shall we take a look? All right, let's take a look at what you have all decided. The tribe has spoken. And what do you believe? 2021, global investment. Let me take a look here. Still rising, which we love. Oh, it's neck and neck. What we're looking at, most of you thinking it is 264 billion. Most of you have chosen that, but it is still growing. We'll see. By the time Caroline comes down, maybe we can still take a look, and maybe that changes. But she'll let you know why we're asking this question. And speaking of questions, do not hesitate. Please put those in via ecosperity.live, or those of you in the room scanning the QR code. We appreciate that, and we'll get this show on the road. We're excited for this panel to take what Ms. Ogunbiyi was saying a little bit further. How do we break through the hurdles together in the renewables revolution? So please welcome to the stage Ms. Caroline Chua, the lead Southeast Asia analyst from BloombergNEF. She's coming up here to the stage. Thank you very much, Caroline. We also have our panelists who have been patiently waiting in the wings since early this morning, having loads of coffee. We're very grateful. Tham is here. He's the head for strategic development and joint head for enterprise development group at Temasek. We have Alfred Wang, the co-founder and CEO of Alpha-ESS. We are in good hands. Thank you so much. And Caroline, over to you. So we had the poll. Most of them thought 264 million last time I looked, or billion, but I'll leave it up to you to take us through the relevant details. Thank you.
Thank you. And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone who's joining us in person or online today. It's a pleasure to be here, and we have heard a lot about growing momentums and a lot more that needs to be done. So I'm very pleased to be facilitating these discussions on how do we overcome challenges in the renewables revolution. COP26 last year saw bolder commitments on 1.5 degrees and net zero emissions targets, and a global recognition of the need to move away from fossil fuels. And through the pandemic, we observed the momentum of energy transition investments remaining very strong. So we had a poll earlier, and in 2021, global investments in the low-carbon energy transition sectors totaled $755 billion. That's a 27% increase from 2020 levels, and actually almost triple from the 2011 levels, and of which the renewable energy sector accounts for almost half of that at $366 billion, led by the solar and wind industries. But despite the clear and very encouraging momentum that we see so far, the sobering reality is that for the world to achieve net zero emissions by the mid-century, the growth in energy transition investments must continue to accelerate. And according to BloombergNEF's 2021 New Energy Outlook net zero scenarios, to get on track for a global net zero pathway that's compliant with well below 2 degrees, investments must triple in the next few years to average around $2.1 trillion annually from 2022 to 2025 and further scale up from that. So to echo from what we heard in the opening speech by Ms. Damilola, investments in clean energy at a much greater scale must be a priority for all stakeholders. And with that, I'd like to open the panel discussion by asking our panelists. We have heard a lot and seen a lot more being invested in the clean energy and renewable sectors today, but I think we all agree now that a lot more still needs to be done. So is the availability of financing for projects and technologies a challenge today? And if so, how can we unlock more capital to enable the energy transition? Russell, if we can start with you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Pleasure to be here. So I think the previous speaker Dale, I think, pointed to a few key points that I was about to talk about in this panel. Is there ample financing for renewable development projects? Generally, there's a lot of financing. One way of looking at it is where the bottlenecks are. Interestingly, I think last month, FT ran an article on how long it takes to connect to the grid when you make an application, and you have to wait up to 10 years. So that got me thinking a bit. If you look at the US statistics in the number of projects that are connected to the grid or applied to connect to the grid, the average waiting time is now creeping up to 4 years, right? So I think that tells you something. It is an indication that the grid, at certain point of renewable energy adoption, will have to transform. And if you look at the statistics behind the US queue, there's about 1,400 gigawatts of solar, wind, and battery projects that have been queued up to be approved, and only about 80 gigawatts of natural gas. And if you look at that ratio from a solar perspective, I think there are about 600 gigawatts queued up in the system. And quite unfortunate, on average, only 20% translates to the grid. So I think you're looking at the grid, to Dale's point earlier, is it ready to absorb that amount of intermittency for renewable energy sources, excluding hydro? So I think that's one thing we all have to work through collectively. On the technology investment, there's a lot of capital going in, as you can see. I think the last 18 months, close to $80 billion has gone into climate tech, and I think a big substantial portion has gone into specifically renewable energies. So I don't think there's a lack of financing, strictly speaking. Yeah.
And Alfred, how about you? As you bring projects to different markets, do you typically encounter financing to be a challenge?
First of all, I think the technology financing is not that difficult currently because a lot of money get into the renewable sectors, seeking for potential companies to be invested. However, for the project finance, there's on the other side, I think there are a lot of financial institutions like the banks. They are still not very familiar with the new technology. For example, I come from the energy storage sector. The banks are not so familiar with the battery technologies. They suspect that if your project can last that long, it's only the manufacturer guarantee is sufficient enough, or those questions has been raised. And normally in this case, there will be third party getting involved, like an insurance company. There are a lot of some insurance company already get into this segment. So like what happens for 15 years with the solar at that time, the finance institute has the similar question about if the solar panel can last that long. It's the same question. And right now, I think that problem could be solved in the near future. And also, there will be much more new technology get introduced into the market. And the finance institute need to get adjust to this part, I think.
Great. I think it's very encouraging to hear that there is money available for the energy transition to happen, and given the scale of investments that we need to get the world on track for net zero by 2050. But it's more of resolving bottlenecks. And Russell, you mentioned about the grid. And I think that's one thing that we hear a lot, especially as we see renewable penetration in power systems increase, especially when it's led by solar and when there are variable energy sources that the traditional grid was not built for. So as the previous speaker also mentioned, we have to upgrade and upgrade existing infrastructures, existing technologies. So Alfred, if I could stick with you. So one of the challenges that we typically hear is about intermittent renewable sources and its impact on power system reliability, the need for sufficient grid and transmission capacity, and also flexibility. So what needs to be done to enable more deployment, and how can storage come into this picture?
Yeah, I think the grid expansion and energy storage is actually the same, from my point of view. Because we are energy storage company, we stand firmly for energy storage because we have seen that what the grid need is a so-called grid-friendly renewables, which should be connected with the energy storage somehow, in some ways. And also, there in the urban regions need to be developed, like in the undeveloped country, in the developing countries. And the renewables always come with energy storage, like even off-grid. Off-grid right now is like solar, wind plus storage plus diesel generator as backup. So we call it, in those projects, we call it diesel replacement. We didn't replace the diesel generator, but the diesel is actually got replaced. And those are also, we can consider as also great expansion. And of course, for the development countries and like Europe, there are a lot of policies, regulations, and also subsidies for the renewable plus storage. And that is the market that's the regulation drive the market, and a subsidy drive the market. And for those markets, because like Germany, they have built the renewables in very high percentage, and the storage is a must currently. No other solutions.
Great. Russell, do you have any views on this?
Yes, I think when we look at the grid as is today, it's obviously designed to be unidirectional. The load, the electricity coming at source were all very stable. And then fast forward 30 years from today, obviously has to look very, very different. So I think that begs a couple of questions that we need to think about. One clear attribute is the grid need to transform. There's a lot of innovation needed in the grid. We conduct microgrids, distributed energy resource systems, next generation SCADAs, and the whole nine yards. So there's a lot of stuff going there. Then we take a step back. All grids are highly regulated. They are utility type business model, and yet we are expecting the grid to go through a massive transformation in the coming years. So I think that creating the environment to allow innovation on the grid without disrupting the grid as this is a very, very critical policy position. I think most utilities, or at least most governments rather, would need to pay a lot of attention, allowing innovation while not disrupting stability, right? I think the other point would be, back to Dale's point, there's no silver bullet. Every piece of the value chain needs to evolve. Battery, next generation technologies, microgrid for the rural communities that have no access to electricity. So we have to look at it very holistically, but I worry the grid is a regulated space, utility model. How do you create the conditions for transformation over the next 3 decades?
Great. Yeah, and I think it's always tricky when you have to find a balance between system security and preparing it for the future. And I think that leads to the next question. We have talked about how capital is not a challenge, the recognition that there needs to be a lot of work done in transforming the grid. But when it comes to financing grid expansions or or deploying flexible solutions, there's often what we see a chicken and egg kind of situation and challenge around it. Do we get the grid ready first before deploying the situations, or do private investors take the leap and deploy the solutions, the renewable energy solutions to storage, and then wait for the grid to catch up, as we are now seeing the situation in Vietnam? They are having to play catch up with all the solar capacities that have been deployed. So as investors and developers of projects, how do you view and manage this uncertainty and challenge? And is it possible to manage it such that the renewable revolution is enabled while still maintaining an economic business case? Russell, if we could start with you.
That's a great question. I guess as an investor, we have a bit more latitude because we look at the entire value chain and decide which part of the value chain is, let's say, ripe for discussion, ripe for investment. So it doesn't necessarily mean we need to deploy capital across the entire value chain. So that's one. On the second point, I think earlier on I said that the first wave of renewable energy adoption, at least on the intermittent type solar and wind, can be absorbed by a grid, a traditional grid without much issue. But after a certain threshold, I think most grids will will feel the strain of that variability. So I think in certain markets, like you said, Vietnam, that point is approaching. I think UK, and I think you see more and more markets. So the chicken egg question is, can the grid transform itself, and for developers, make sure we have storage solutions that are economically competitive. Again, depend on the duration. You need to make sure it's stable. If you want a severe disruption, you need multi-day energy storage. You want a 4-hour disruption, you can use lithium ion. So the cost curves are coming down. I could imagine more and more, and it's already happening, renewable energy developers going onto the grid with that storage. Now, I think there's some regulatory things you need to think about in various jurisdictions. Yeah.
Alfred?
Yeah, of course, and like in China, I can give you some example in China. Right now, because the Chinese government has launched the carbon neutralization emission last year, I think, then right now there's a lot of, all the regulation has been changed sharply since then. Right now, all the solar and the wind projects need to combine with at least 10% 2 hours energy storage. And that is a must. Yeah? That is a must. So the problem for China is we don't have a very flexible energy market to regulate the energy storage projects, because for those projects, energy storage actually doesn't bring any income for the investors. However, that's by this regulation, because in this case, the investors are looking the solar or farm projects, solar or wind farm projects with energy storage together. So they will calculate their IRR together with energy storage. That is why China has deployed actually very, very large scale energy storage in the last year, and even larger pipeline in the near future. However, there is also advantage and disadvantage. Advantage is fast. Everybody needs to do it. That's very fast. But the disadvantage is the investor don't actually use the energy storage. The energy storage system are regulated or are controlled by the state grid, but the investment are from the investors. So the investor doesn't care about the quality and the duration of the projects, of the products. So that depends on what can be changed. Like in Europe, we have seen there are some policy change with some Eastern Europe countries. They have for their solar or wind project tendering, you must have also 10% maybe the energy storage with you, but your energy storage projects are deployed on the energy market. So you will do the frequent regulation, grid services, so you can still get income from the market. Maybe not sufficient enough, but with your solar and farm, from both sides subsidized, the project can be profitable. So in that case, the investors are really looking for good products. So that's, I think, a better solution.
Great.
Yeah, just add on to Alfred's view. I think in certain jurisdictions in Europe, I was listening to some podcasts the other day. They created a sandbox to see how you can plug into the grid. And interestingly, some business models about, I'm just plugging the battery to the grid, and I offer a service around it. I'm offering fast response service, load balancing services. So all these narrow slivers of services are being tried out in a sandbox environment. So I think something worth considering for various countries who are looking at this.
Yeah, and I think you guys have mentioned a couple of times about the regulatory and policy environment needs to first enable these products or these solutions to be deployed. There needs to be market. And I think the unfortunate thing, or rather what we see often in Southeast Asia or ASEAN, is a lot of times the power market structure perhaps is not yet at a stage that allows that to happen, such as in Europe. But I think the good thing and the encouraging thing is we have all these lessons that we can look around the world and see really what works and what not. You know, we can look at the results of these sandbox projects to see what really fits the market. And as Russell, you mentioned, perhaps when we are having conversations about the regulation side, then from the private sector side, the research, the development of technologies, the investment, the search for investment opportunities must happen concurrently, so that as and when these opportunities happen, then investors can really scale up very, very quickly. And I think that the next one that I want to get, Alfred, your view on is just as how energy investment trends have shifted over the last decade. I think future challenges for the renewable revolution could also change because as we have more and more renewable penetration on the grid, and as intermittency increases, the variance between supply and demand deepens, there could be, requirement for longer storage duration. So some of these requirements could currently exceed the capabilities of current technologies or solutions. How do you see the storage solutions evolving, both technologically and on an application basis, to meet these longer balancing demand?
Of course, at the beginning, the energy storage market started with very little applications, because only those little applications could justify the financial benefits of the energy storage. But in the future, we have seen there are more and more applications because of because the cost of energy storage is coming down for the last decade. There will be, I think, 80% is coming down, and it's continually, maybe a little bit interrupted with this COVID time, but in the future, I think for the most important evolving direction of the energy storage system is still the cost. It must be cost effective. If you have lower cost, you can enable more applications. Second direction, of course, is to have a smarter system, and this smarter system means that you can manage multifunction applications at the same time with the same system. You can do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 applications, so you can benefit from 5 applications, and that make your project more profitable. So of course, for the long duration, that depends on much cheaper batteries in future. So there we have seen a lot of investment into the new battery types, like the non-ion batteries, and we are waiting for those technology to be mature, so that we can develop such kind of products, so we can use for the projects to enable even larger markets.
Great. So I think, as we are waiting for innovations on batteries, specifically battery storage and products, there are also emerging technologies to watch out for. And this decade has really been termed the decade of action. Not only do we need to see an immediate, unprecedented scale-up of existing technologies, we need to deploy more renewables, more storage, more electric vehicles. But within this decade, it is also critical to get these new emerging technologies ready to scale at massive deployment stage, at commercial scale. So Russell, can you just share what are some of the emerging technologies that Temasek is watching out for, and how do you view the feasibility of these technologies, given that we have a relatively short timeline to get them ready, and some of them are still quite costly today, or perhaps yet unproven at commercial scale?
Okay. Great question. So let me comment a bit about the classes of technology Temasek is very keen in. Then to your latter part of the question, how do we look at it, or how do we assess whether we should invest? So if you kind of bifurcate the technology investment in this context of this discussion, direct generation of electricity, which is green, so let's call it green electrons. So we look at a host of potential pathways, and I think back to the earlier point, there's no silver bullet. So next generation PV, as much as the solar PV cost has come down very drastically, what's the next leg down, right? It could be perovskite, it's been talked around a long time. Is the cycle life sufficient for the market? We look at micro wind turbines that could have micro use cases in the future. Further out, fusion could potentially be a major game changer. We have made investments in that regards. Geothermal could be the other option. You just go down and tap the Earth's heat. And there's a lot of oil and gas technology that can be brought to bear. And I think we also have deployed some capital along those lines. Complementing that, obviously, storage. We talked about it. We have deployed capital in long duration storage to the tune of 100 hours. Various kind of battery technologies for the EV space. If the EV space, as it drives the cost curve down, it's also relevant to the power generation. So we have that whole portfolio. We've increasingly, during COVID, accelerated this deployment. On the indirect piece, I think the other panel will talk about, right, how do you create green fuel to generate? So we've invested in electrolyzers, hydrogen carriers, looking at what's the next generation gas turbines that allow green fuels to be used, and obviously carbon capture technology. So again, we have deployed capital there. Coming to how we look at it, not exactly rocket science. First, you need to understand on the first principle basis what the technology could be, if it's more or less fully de-risked, what's that performance envelope, what's the unit costs you need to deploy. Then you've got to project into the future, a bit of a crystal ball. You've got to understand how the market will pan out in the future, what your customers' behavior will be like, what the competitive technology pathways could do. Then you get a view, and then if you look at a company, what's their R&D strategy, what's their product architecture strategy, what's their business model. There's a fuse together, then you make a judgment call.
Great, but I think most importantly, it won't be an easy journey. I think most importantly, what we see is there are a lot of innovations, and some of these technologies you mentioned, like micro wind turbines, cheaper solar panels, different kind of technologies on that, are perhaps what is needed to unlock the opportunities in regions that are naturally perhaps a little bit more disadvantaged when it comes to natural resources, and it's so crucial to enable those roadmaps there. And we have about 5 minutes left, and I think it's important to address some of the disruptions that we are seeing in the markets today. And so we are faced with perhaps what one might term the 4 Cs of today, right? We have climate change being a big topic. We have just gone through 2-3 years of COVID-19. We are seeing commodities inflation and, of course, conflict in the world. And all of these affect energy prices. It affects supply chains. So how have the disruptions impacted investors and developers like yourself? And what does it highlight in terms of managing risk in the energy transition? Russell, if we could start with you.
20 years ago, the 4 Cs in Singapore meant quite different stuff, but today's context quite different. So I think climate change, COVID, commodities inflation, and conflict, right? I think climate change or climate emergency depends how you frame it. From Temasek's perspective, it's an absolute imperative. We are fully committed to this journey. Yesterday, you heard the announcement of Gen Zero. So if you relate that to the 3 other drivers of what could impact climate change or energy transition, at Temasek, COVID, we literally accelerated. Counterintuitively, the world did too, right? So I don't think COVID held us back, almost kind of brought accelerated momentum. You can make a case that the fiscal and monetary conditions were even more conducive thanks to the quantitative easing and the rates. So that you can see huge amount of capital deployed. On commodities inflation, it cuts both ways, right? It makes fossil fuel stuff more expensive, but at the same time, the entire supply chain for renewable energies could be more expensive. So it's just inflationary in nature. You've got to see this back and forth going. On the conflict, the war in Ukraine obviously has changed a lot of how people look at it. I think first and foremost, for most policymakers, at least in Europe, energy security comes right to the forefront. The rest are secondary. So I think they're tackling that first. But I view it as a minor speed bump, right? Where after you get through this speed bump, you need to re-architect your energy strategy. If you need to build a new strategy, you might as well solve climate change as soon as possible. So maybe a slight deceleration, then you can see an acceleration thereafter. So that's how I look at it. But hard to be precise about this. So that's my view.
And Alfred?
Yeah. We've seen that during these difficult times, right? So, but all 4 C factors you mentioned is actually a positive push for the renewable markets, Because right now, due to the conflict in Ukraine, due to the rising energy prices, especially the electricity price, not only the European countries, the policymakers are thinking about energy security, but also all the nations. Because right now, so we have seen the electricity price in Germany for the residential could rise to 50 euro cents per kilowatt hour, and this totally changed the deep mindset of the energy price. People have never imagined they are facing this kind of energy prices. And even though after the crisis, the energy price comes a little bit down, but they still want to be independent, at least partially independent. So in that case, so what we have seen the residential markets in Europe is right now, both solar and energy storage are totally booming. And the limitation is not the market demand right now, it's the installation capacity and delivery of the goods. And that makes the markets even hotter. Right now, we have seen the installers, distributors are hoarding the products. And that's the positive benefit from the renewable sectors. I think the other push will be the inflation rate. Because the inflation rate in Europe is right now very, very high, and the people who have savings in the bank account want to invest, either buy some properties, if they buy property, they will want solar and storage, or they want to invest into energy generation products for their own house, so that they can have a much more secure and cheaper energy. Then that's how the market changed.
Yeah, great. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the road ahead won't be easy, right? And with any radical transformation and transition of any systems, there will be bound to throw up problems that needs to be solved and adjustments that need to be made. And Russell, you mentioned that we love our acronyms here in Singapore. So perhaps the answer to enabling the renewables revolution lies in another 4C. And I borrow this from what I read previously about crisis leadership: more communication between all stakeholders, collaboration both domestically, regionally, internationally, involving the community, because we really need everyone to get on board to solve the challenges ahead, and consistency in our goal, and not to be derailed by short-term changes and disruptions. And with that, we have come to the end of panel. I thank you, my panelists, for the insightful sharing, and I hope this fuels more conversations in the days ahead. Thank you.